with Human Rights Watch, and I'm happy to see you here today. We will have all heard the High Commissioner's statement yesterday where he addressed the situation in Bahrain and described how grave it has become in terms of a complete shutdown of democracy, the crackdown on human rights defenders and activists, and where he also said that he has repeatedly been bringing up the situation to the Human Rights Council. Indeed, this has been a very grave year in Bahrain. The year started off with the reinstatement of the death penalty and continued on with giving the national security agencies, the NSA, the power domestically again. And this agency, of course, was implicated with the widespread and systematic torture in Bahrain in 2011. So with these grave developments in mind, our panelists here today will help us better understand and uncover various dimensions of the deterioration of the situation in Bahrain, and particularly the ways in which counterterrorism is being used as a guise to repress, suppress, and violate the rights of civilians and activists in Bahrain. So with that, please allow me to introduce our panelists today. To my left, we have Ariel Plotkin. Ariel is the Bahrain researcher leading Amnesty's work and advocacy on Bahrain. She has been also covering Iraq for Amnesty while doing their Bahrain work for the past 4 years. Ariel last visited Bahrain in January 2015, but has been denied access ever since. To my right, we have Devin Kenney. Devin handles ADHRB's international law portfolio. He's a licensed attorney in New York, and he completed his JD and MA in international studies at the University of Oregon. He's worked with local and international groups in Egypt, Gaza, Golan, Israel, Jordan, and in Turkey. And then to my right, again, we have Harriet McCulloch. She's the deputy director at Reprieve, trained as a solicitor with a Magic Circle firm in London, and she's been a caseworker for Reprieve, as well as having worked on issues related to capital trials, access to justice, prisoners' rights, particularly in Southeast Asia, in Malawi, and in the United States. So I think we're in very good hands when it comes to digging deeper into the situation in Bahrain, and particularly how counterterrorism is used to violate rights. So with that, I'll give the floor to Ariel. Ariel, I know that Amnesty recently published a new report on the human rights situation, and particularly the topic at hand. So if you could give us an overview and analysis of the trends and violations, we would appreciate that.
Called No One Can Protect You, Bahrain's Year of Crushing Dissent. And in it, we've documented how the Bahraini authorities have dramatically stepped up the crackdown on the rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. Between June 2016 and June 2017, we saw at least 169 peaceful critics or their families relentlessly targeted by the Bahraini authorities in a wide range of ways, which I'll go into a bit more detail later. We saw the political opposition dismantled, activists tortured and imprisoned, and the only independent newspaper, Al-Wasat, shut down. We also saw the blockade of, within that year, the blockade of Duraz village for 11 months, nationality revocations, executions, forced expulsion, and the violent force of use of force by security forces against peaceful protesters, resulting in the death of 6 people, including 1 child. And that was only in that single year period. And of course, the crackdown continues today, and we continue to see a fully blown human rights crisis in Bahrain. For example, one of the ways the Bahraini authorities have targeted human rights defenders is subjecting them to an arbitrary travel ban so that they can't be with us here today in Geneva. This has happened at every Human Rights Council session for the past year and a half. And just this week, including this morning, one of a former opposition leader, Ebrahim Sharif, he was charged for illegal gathering, and this is just an excuse for the Bahraini authorities to subject him to a travel ban so that he can't come to Geneva, even if he wasn't planning to. So what we're seeing is repeatedly these violations by the Bahraini authorities to prevent peaceful critics to speak out against their government and join us today. So, as I said, we documented at least 169 peaceful critics or their relatives targeted between June 2016 and June 2017. So they were subjected to travel bans, interrogated repeatedly, threatened, some of them were imprisoned, and some of them were tortured, including sexually assaulted, which is something we've seen for the first time. Nabil Rajab, prominent human rights defender in Bahrain, was rearrested in June 2016 and put in solitary confinement for over 9 months. And his health was rapidly deteriorating, and he's in a prison hospital today. 2 months ago, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for giving media interviews, and he's also on trial for tweeting, and he faces up to 15 years for that. Scores of activists, as I said, were repeatedly summoned for interrogation throughout the year on baseless charges, or they were charged in relation to their peaceful expression. And what is extremely worrying is that these activists are now being interrogated before the terrorism unit of the public prosecution, or by the National Security Agency, which I'm sure we'll hear more about later. And these are both signs that the authorities consider peaceful activists to be, and peaceful critics to be, a security threat or to be quote-unquote terrorists. So this is extremely worrying to us. We've also seen the prevalent use of torture, not seen the prevalent use of torture against human rights defenders and political activists in Bahrain since 2011. And however, in May alone, we received reports of at least 8 human rights defenders and political activists who were interrogated by the NSA, where they were tortured, threatened, to stop their human rights or political activities, and then released. One activist in particular I'd like to speak to about today is Ebtissam al-Saif, who is also a prominent human rights defender who was arrested in May. She was beaten, blindfolded, made to stand for the 7 hours of her interrogation, and she was also sexually assaulted by NSA agents. She was then threatened that she must stop her human rights work or she would face consequences. And bravely, she continued to speak out, and as a result, in July, she was rearrested, and she's now being charged in relation to terrorism, which of course are baseless charges. We consider her to be a prisoner of conscience and should be released immediately. So as I said, the authorities in this year period went to new lengths to silence and instill fear in their critics. It's very clear that this is a new... The new lengths that they go to is not only to ensure that there is no criticism, but also to ensure that those who've previously criticized Bahrain, both outside the country and inside the country, are now too scared to speak out. We've long seen critics inside the country being subjected to harassment, arrest, prosecution, but what we've documented as new was that the critics outside Bahrain were also being targeted, and their family members back in Bahrain were being arrested and interrogated and threatened because of the human rights activities of their relatives abroad, mostly in the UK. Also, we documented a higher level of excessive use of force in this year by the security forces, and this also included for the first time NSA officers coming out as well against the mass protests that were taking place mostly since the beginning of this year. We documented for the first time in a long time the use of live ammunition, the continued use of birdshot, tear gas. We also saw armoured vehicles being driven into crowds of protesters, and peaceful protests also being beaten by security forces while they're protesting. And as a result, we saw 6 people killed, including a 17-year-old child. 5 of those killed was in a single day in Duraz village on the 23rd of May this year. And I think it's really important to talk about how, while these blatant human rights violations were taking place, the international community really, responded in a shockingly inadequate way. There was no real condemnation of what's been happening, and I'm speaking in particular about the UK government, which continues to praise Bahrain on its progress on reform, while we do not see this, and not condemn what, the huge crackdown that we and others have documented. And as a result of both the repression and the lack of the international response, the once thriving civil society who would normally be with us here today, and who regularly attend the Human Rights Council sessions, have been silenced either through fear of what would happen if they spoke out and they go back to Bahrain, or because they can't be here because of a travel ban to speak here today, or they've been put behind bars. So I think I will leave it at that and welcome any questions later.
Thank you so much, Ariel. And I think with regards to what you said about the shocking response or lack thereof, I think it's in the situation in Bahrain, in fact, correlates with those joint statements no longer taking place, and it correlates with less scrutiny at the Human Rights Council. So that's also been quite worrisome. With that, I would like to ask you, Devin, if you could help us understand better the counterterrorism statutes that enable some of the violations that we have just heard about from Ariel.
Right. Thank you, Laila, for the introduction, and thank you, Ariel, for the factual background. So I'm a lawyer, and that means I'm going to talk about the law, which means this will be the most boring segment of the panel, so apologies in advance. I'm not going to talk about international law. I'm going to speak about Bahraini domestic law, and it is a dry subject, but I think there is real value to be had in looking at the domestic or national laws of repressive states. There's a number of reasons for that, but I'll just touch on one here. Looking at domestic laws can often allow you to avoid an unnecessary phase of argument with an abusive state. Facts about the real world, as anyone who's ever studied anything in depth will know, are often really difficult to establish. Any factual situation touching on politics is going to come down to several parties presenting contending and incompatible views of what happened. But the law is the voice of the state. It's what the government chooses to say according to its own processes, in its own words, and as published in its own official gazettes. So if you can establish that the law itself is abusive, then you can often skip over this phase of arguing about whether a particular act in a particular set of circumstances was abusive or not. The law speaks for itself, and it isn't subject to easy denial the way most allegations are. So that preface said, we'll look at Bahrain's counterterrorism statute specifically. There are three pieces of legislation to be aware of. There was a base law, which was passed in 2006, and then it's been amended twice, once in 2013 and once in 2014. The primary thing to know about the base legislation on counterterrorism of 2006 is that it established an extremely vague and broad definition of terrorism. And this is really the key question when you're looking at terrorism statutes or law in any country, is how they define terrorism. Because you then, if in a law you have other provisions relating to terrorist crimes that may appear on their face reasonable, if the underlying definition of terrorism is overbroad, over-inclusive, repressive, then it will end up corrupting all those other provisions eventually, no matter how reasonable they may appear on their face. So to give an example, I assume we would all agree that it is legitimate for states to outlaw their citizens giving money to Daesh. So then you might have a law that says something like, it shall be a felony for any person to provide funding for a terrorist organization. And that appears fine at first glance, but if you look deeper and find that terrorism is defined to include public protest, as it very much has been in Bahrain, then that provision takes on a whole different meaning and a whole different set of potentially very repressive applications. So what is Bahrain's definition of terrorism? Well, I really wish I had a PowerPoint so I could put it up and show you and you could read it at length and judge for yourselves. As kind of a poor substitute, I've printed up this, which I know is not going to be large enough, but perhaps some people closer to the front can see, and I'll read it to you. And then also I had a copy which is with my colleague Tyler, who might pass it around if anyone cares to see it. This provision of law is a huge brick. It's just one paragraph that's not broken up into sentences. It's very dense and difficult to get through, and I don't think that's just because I'm not a native Arabic speaker. I think it's that way in character, probably deliberately. So cutting out a lot of the extraneous verbiage and just giving you what I think are the important parts of this law without altering its meaning. It defines terrorism to include not just the political use of violence, but also, quote, any illegitimate means constituting a crime punishable by law to which an offender resorts with the purpose of infringing public security or endangering the safety and security of the kingdom or of damaging national unity, if such means by its nature harms the environment, public health, the national economy, or public property institutions or facilities, or prevents or impedes public authorities, houses of worship, or institutes of learning from exercising their functions. So a lot of wording. I've highlighted some of the most egregious here, but really almost every single word in there is problematic at some level. It doesn't take much of a stretch of the imagination to understand how language this broad can be used to apply to essentially any form of public protest. And indeed, you do find in Bahrain that public protest is de facto illegal at this point. The following paragraph from the exact same article of the 2006 law defines a terrorist crime, quotes, as any felony, quoting, committed with a terrorist purpose. Terrorist purpose is not independently defined. All we have to look back to is the general definition of terrorism, which I've just given you. And as we saw, it states that terrorism can involve purposes such as infringing the security of the kingdom, damaging national unity, or impeding public authorities from exercising their functions. So again, this would really cover any form of public demonstration and dissent more broadly. And then the rest of the 2006 law is just a recitation of terrorism-related crimes. A lot of provisions might appear reasonable on their face, but as I said, they become quite unreasonable when you consider what the definition of terrorism underneath it all is. Some of the provisions, I should say, are silly or unreasonable on their face. My personal favorite, as it were, is Article 4, which makes it a terrorist crime to, quote, spread a substance in the air with intent to endanger the natural environment if done in execution of a terrorist purpose. So, you know, if you sprayed like an aerosol can in the air while thinking bad thoughts about the monarchy, then you would be a terrorist seeking to undermine national unity, potentially, under the language of the law. So that's a sample from the base law of 2006. The amendments of 2013 and 2014 didn't do anything to change the basic definition. They simply added some more regressive provisions and made certain articles already in the laws even harsher. One article from the 2013 amendments reads, anyone who incites another to commit a crime in execution of a terrorist purpose, even if no effect results from his action, shall be punished by imprisonment. So, repeat, anyone who incites, even if no effect results. I think it's pretty apparent on its face how extreme that is. It's punishment for essentially nothing happening. The 2013 amendments also authorized denaturalization, which means stripping of nationality for various acts, including incitement. And since, as we just saw, incitement is criminalized, and what Bahrain calls terrorism might be a street demonstration, then a logical consequence could be that simple verbal criticism of the government could result in the person being made stateless, stripped of their nationality, with the logic being that criticizing the government is incitement to protest, and protest is terrorism. And the 2013 amendments also added this provision that would actually be kind of funny if it weren't for the fact that people are already being prosecuted under it and suffering because of it. This is what you would call the fake bomb article. So it reads, and I'm quoting, "Anyone who places or transports models or forms resembling explosives or capable of being believed to be explosives shall be punished by imprisonment." Again, I think it's pretty evident on its face how absurd that is. If you're simply carrying anything, whatever it may be, that the security forces say is capable of being believed to be explosives, then they can deem that a fake bomb and can then imprison you for that, regardless of any intent you may have had. And then that was all from the 2013 amendments. The 2014 amendments, which are the last we'll be covering here, formally removed most of the remaining vestiges of protection against arbitrary detention. In practice, there really was not protection to begin with, but the 2014 law has made the situation even more draconian. Under the new language of the law, security officers are allowed to make detentions by stopping pedestrians, vehicles, and public transportation if there is, quote, "sufficient evidence of the possibility of occurrence of a terrorist crime." And they're also allowed to cut off communications from an area where they're undertaking a counter-terrorist operation, as they deem it. So you could have a situation that is basically just mass home arrests, mass detentions, and they could cut off all forms of communication, including cell phones, media, whatever, essentially impose a blackout on the area while they're going house to house arresting people. And then as for what happens after detention or arrest, 2014 amendments authorize the police to hold you for 28 days before you have to be transferred to the Office of Public Prosecution. Again, to the Office of Public Prosecution, not to a court. And then once you're in the Office of Public Prosecution, there is a new special terrorism unit of prosecution created, which Ariel referred to. And this new and quite secretive unit is allowed to detain you for another 6 months. This is before you have a single day in court, let alone get to trial. This is before you have the opportunity to contest your detention before a judge or have what we'd call a habeas corpus hearing in the Anglo-American legal tradition. So that's 7 months total you could be held before seeing a judge. And there are many, many more articles I could go through, some kind of darkly comic and some just patently awful, but I think you get the general idea. I've stuck to the counterterrorism laws in my remarks because those fit most closely within the topic of this panel, but I would actually like to close on a slightly broader note without going before a judge. And then after 45 days, they have to be taken for a judge, but then under the regular penal code, or excuse me, actually under the Code of Criminal Procedure, different section of the law, the judge can simply indefinitely renew the detention in the pre-trial stage. And really the point of being brought before a judge is to get the part where you actually get to contest what's happening to you. Like habeas corpus proceedings is the Anglo-American term again, and eventually trial. But the judge can simply keep renewing this for 45 days. Lawyers in Bahrain were really upset about not having the opportunity to go before judges for 7 months after the new law, because lawyers love to go in court and argue, but honestly, I'm not sure it makes that much.
The remit of our work is limited to death penalty cases, but it has been our experience that raising the profile of individual cases can protect people from execution, although sadly not the 3 men who were executed earlier this year. We feel that it's vitally important that the case of Mohammed Ramadan and Hussein Musa and the other cases that have come through are repeatedly publicly and privately, any way that works, really raised by anyone who Bahrain will listen to, and that specific recommendations are made, not simple opposition to the imposition of the death penalty, but clear, specific opposition to the execution of people who have been convicted on the basis of confessions that were forced out of them using torture, and where terrorism, counterterrorism narratives and offences are being used to silence political dissent. So unfortunately, after the execution of the 3 men in January 17, we didn't see that kind of statement from the UK government, but we hope that they will reconsider this approach and take a more specific and condemnatory, really, approach to Mohammed and Hussein's cases, and those other people on death row. To touch on Michael's question about what space is there to work in, we have seen the European Parliament take up the issue of Bahrain with energy and pass an urgency resolution on the cases of Mohammed and Hussein. We've also engaged in constructive conversations, really, with Congress people and organizations in DC in relation to the death penalty in the region, and there seems to be some more, I think, active media coverage of the issue of the death penalty in the American media. So I think that is an avenue to explore.
A couple of years ago, I've been involved with this for a long time, but I was sent a video of someone who was being tortured in a barn, and the capture was taken by someone who was at the event but was letting me know it was happening. So it was a young man, and he was being beaten by 4 or 5 guys around him who were in uniform, and he was shouting, and obviously it was very distressing to watch it. And I thought, what can I do? I can't do anything about this right now. I'm really at a loss as to how to do anything. And I didn't know if I should put it on social media or, and I was hunting around to try to find somebody who could help immediately. And the next morning, his body was found on the roof of a farm, and they had killed him. Salah was his name. He was a young guy, a young father, and he was a real hero for the movement. He would always be mobilizing for peaceful demonstrations. He wasn't a violent character himself, very highly respected in his community, and sadly missed by his family and his friends. But that kind of situation is not an isolated situation. And now we have quite a number. There's been some publications. There's quite a number of people who've gone missing incommunicado for months. And I'm wondering, what practical things can we be doing about that? How I know about raising awareness on social media can be very effective. Just if I may for just a moment, I know we're pressed on time, but I had another colleague who was abducted from his home. This was in Istanbul, and just to give you an example of how I feel social media can be profoundly helpful. So he was abducted, and another very high-profile character in a completely different environment, but his driver contacted me and said, "This man has been taken, I don't know what to do." So I called embassies, and I called people at the UN and activists, and started to tweet about it and put it on Facebook and Instagram, and there was a chorus of sound. And the guy was in a forest. He was being beaten. He was in a forest. They had guns. He knew that he was going to be assassinated. And one of the guys happened to look at his phone and saw that the name was coming up on social media, and people were going, "Where is he?" And they brought him back to the main road, and they dropped him off. So we can't underestimate the power that we have as a social media community. It's profound now in this day and age. But for the people who are disappeared, that we haven't heard from, there's no sight or sound of them at all. Ali Abdulrahman was missing. Thanks be to God, he got out of the country. It was a terrible a misadventure for him to come out, but these people are missing because they've been abducted. So I'm just keen to hear any kind of encouragement of something that can be done practically on that, and thank you all for your contributions.
Thank you very much.
The international community and even Bahrain's allies in the West, like the U.S. and the U.K., have not been as proactive on addressing a lot of these issues. Have you seen any, and this can be to the whole panel, but have you seen any areas where different bodies, whether they're here or in Brussels or elsewhere, that might also have been taking some action on this or bringing some attention to this? Is there space that we can build on to be able to move forward? Certainly, NGOs have raised the case, sort of trying to build a case for bringing the issue of Bahrain back to Geneva and to sort of restart the process there. And I think that there's certainly a big value to that. But where else can we look for other sources of momentum on this? So that's one. And the second was. In Devin's comments, he was really talking a lot about, the counterterrorism law. He sort of mentioned that there's a bigger toolbox there that the government has. And I don't know if you can, speak a little bit about, perhaps, the redundancies within the law that, that there are these other areas. Where do we see these other?
What was the other question?
Was once they're convicted under these unjust laws, what happens to them? Where are they tried?
Oh, right. I think the question was specifically about people being tried under the counterterrorism laws. For the most part to date, they've been tried in the regular court system, but just this year, Bahrain made a very specific, very narrow amendment to its constitution in order to allow the government to try civilians within military courts, which both of my co-panelists alluded to, and it appears that they will start shifting to that system. I mean, they changed the whole constitution because of it. That's significant. And then to date, I know of just one case concretely, which is Fadl Abbas Raddi, the clear-cut disappearance that Ariel was discussing. He's been transferred to military jurisdiction. He's the only one I know of. It's probably a trial case to see how it goes and if there's any pushback. But I expect we will see more of this military trials of civilians.
We still have time for one last round of questions and comments, if there's any more from the floor. Okay, seeing none, I think I'll just give the panelists a chance at any final remarks you might have.
And there's an ombudsman of the NSA as well, which has been relatively silent since its creation. And now we really need to test whether this NSA ombudsman, although I don't have much, I don't think it will bring about accountability, but I think we need to now test the NSA ombudsman on bringing about accountability for the violations that are currently happening by the NSA. So I think it's just an additional comment on that.
Topics and was sort of minimally addressed out of them. And I'll just do the thing again where I tell you about Bahraini law provisions. I know you love that. The NSA was established by a royal decree in 2002, and I think there are two interesting things you can extract from this decree. One, it wasn't really created. The actual explicit text of the law says in the very first article, the term National Security Agency shall be substituted for the name of the previous agency, which was, it had a long name, I'm not going to remember the whole thing in Arabic, but it ends in Aman ad-Dawla, which is state security. And so, yeah, the law just explicitly says it's just a name change. And to this date, the Aman ad-Dawla, state security, was extremely widely feared in Bahrain and was notorious. And to this day, people colloquially refer to the NSA as Aman ad-Dawla because they perceive it to be the same agency correctly. It's not really significant that it had its title changed in practice. And incidentally, I believe there's some interesting stuff about how Aman ad-Dawla goes all the way back to Britain's role in establishing the institutions of modern repression in Bahrain, but that's a historical story. And the other interesting takeaway from the law establishing the NSA is, well, the character or nature of the law is a royal decree, And it states within the decree that the head of the NSA is, here's in my notes, so I can say this with confidence. He is appointed directly by the king and officially has a position in the cabinet. So it just, you might think that the state would attempt to kind of create some firewalls or deniability barriers between the guys at the top and the ugliest part of repression represented by the NSA, but the NSA sits on the cabinet and is directly appointed by the king. They're a part of the civil government openly and formally, and are openly and formally the head of this institution is appointed by the monarchy. So both civil government and monarchy are very much implicated in its activities directly, formally, by their own law, not simply in practice.
Can influence Bahrain. At the same time, as Ariel and others have said, a statement here at the Council does matter. We've seen that Bahrain spends a lot of energy on waging a pretty glossy PR campaign in the context of the Human Rights Council and other places, which is an indication that to some extent it still does care what the international community says and what international bodies say. The letter that I mentioned earlier that NGOs launched ahead of this session urging the Council to take a principled approach, other than being a plea for urgent action, it was also a mapping exercise that took the criteria that states had signed onto, those objective criteria for action. It took each criteria, it's things like special rapporteurs calling for action and raising concern, the High Commissioner raising strong concern and calling for action. It's a variety of different trigger mechanisms, and we basically took each one of those and mapped the facts up against the criteria, and it becomes very clear, as I think is obvious to anyone who's listened to our presenters, that Bahrain definitely meets every single threshold that should be triggering principled action by the Council. So that is one small but important step to start. So with that, I would just like to thank you so much for coming. Our panelists will be probably, if I can say, around outside of the room for a little bit if you have any further questions or comments. And thank you for joining us here today. And thank you to our panelists and also the many co-sponsors of this event for making it happen.